Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower, educate, and inspire men in a positive way. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. Okay, in the last podcast, we talked about peace and the types of peace. And in this podcast, it's going to be a bit of a rant, but also some really important stuff about how to begin to think about the sorts of topics that we're talking about. And in this podcast, I want to cover the issue that patriarchy fundamentally disturbs the process of peace, both internally and socially. Okay? And therefore, in fundamental principles, attacks overall well-being, both of the individual, but also the community. Okay? And the way that it does that in modern society is through the weaponized arm of neoliberalism. That ideology is fundamentally at the root of the current fragmentation in our community, and by definition also the fragmentation of ourselves individually. Okay, so how did I get onto this topic? Well, I've been watching the local media as well as global media fairly intensely, as most of you probably have picked up. And one of the issues that has really stood out for me, and there's both personal experience with this, but it's also through the media, is that whole inequity between the 1%, those who enable the 1%, and the majority of us. Okay, and there's a distinct clash in this with what makes our community democratic and what inhibits democratic process. So let me get to the point. Okay, in Australia, over the last 48 hours, nurses have been striking. And part of the reason for the strike is that there's been more and more expectations placed on nursing staff by, their governing bodies in the hospitals, but also from the Department of Health and the Ministry of Health, and then the politicians at large. And part of the argument has been around the issue about ratios between staff and patients. And as COVID impacted on the amount of staff available to cover shifts and the number of patients have been blowing out, staff have become progressively more and more fatigued. So in my book, as someone who's worked in a leadership role and who continuously works clinically with people who, in my view, are fundamentally the front line of what it is that we as a community do for each other, it's become untenable. The government and the leadership, the management in these organisations are failing, in my perspective, in their duty of care. Not only is it putting patients at risk, but if you're going to have fatigued, underworked, overworked and underpaid staff, we're going to have some serious problems. Now, when it comes to remuneration, nurses have been fighting for salary increases over 16 years and have got virtually nothing. Let's stick with they've got nothing. In the meantime, in Australia, politicians have managed in the last few years to give themselves a 16% salary increase. For what, I'm not quite sure, because we certainly have got some major issues there. Now, this is not confined only to Australia and the Australian context. We see this in the UK and the United States as well. Okay, so what's behind this? Well, one of the things I want to put together is a good argument for the connection between patriarchy and neoliberalism. In other words, patriarchy is the toxic ideology of men's superiority, especially white privileged males, and neoliberalism is, really complex, but in the main, it is a political and economic ideology, a story that we tell ourselves about what makes this work. And why do I want to do this? Well, because I want to expose, in a way, the link between this fragmentation and the economic and cultural impact that this is having, and more importantly, in many respects, the well-being on the community at large. So when I start thinking about these processes, usually what I do is I go through 4 questions in my head, in a way, as a sort of part of a root cause analysis. It's more complicated than that, but the 4 key questions is, how does the idea fit into what I already know? Number 1. Secondly, can this be explained by something else? Number 3, what does X mean for Y? And number 4, how can I see this idea to explain Y? Okay, so let me get into the gist of it. Okay, so in my framework, patriarchy fundamentally presents a 4-tiered value set. Okay, fundamentally, that patriarchy rests on being territorial, it rests on being hierarchical, acquisitional, competitive, and when all else fails, it's going to become combative. Okay? So how does this fit in this particular context? Well, the territory fundamentally is the workplace. And there is a very distinct hierarchy established in a workplace whereby you have people who've got a specific knowledge and skills base and experience, and then you have those at the top of the hierarchy which in many cases do not have the skill set, the education and the knowledge base than those on the clinical front line do. Okay, now I've seen this as a psychologist in the Department of Health where, administrators are making clinical decisions, which in my book, without consultation, is inappropriate. But it happens all the time. So essentially, the implication in a patriarchal system is that you will do as you are told by those at the top of the hierarchy. Okay, so in the context of the nurses, the admin and the ministerial body is basically saying you will adhere to what we tell you to in terms of staffing and the ratio between staff and patients. Now, as I said, I think this is particularly problematic because it's going to cost patient lives, and it is also going to cost the lives of staff, because we know from current research that's going on that clinical staff are progressively becoming more and more psychologically distressed and injured, and therefore there is an increase in the level of suicide in this particular population. And one of the real issues that we're identifying is that those who've been in the system longer are less likely to reach out for help. Now, part of that, and I'm going to argue from my point of view, is more than likely because they're cynical about it, okay? And so when we put patriarchy together with the neoliberal context of, how we organised the economic infrastructure and superstructure of our society, we're dealing with some prevailing myths that really intrude on how we can be more effective. So let me outline that. So fundamentally, neoliberalism has a couple of myths running. I mean, remember, neoliberalism is not a scientific theory that's been put into practice. It's a bit like economics, despite its, mathematical whiz-bangery, is actually not a science. No matter how they argue the toss, it is not a science. It's a story that we use to describe what supposedly happens between the various bodies and peoples and so on. if it was more scientific, it'd have a degree of predictability around certain issues, and we probably wouldn't have run into global financial crisis the way we did. So what are some of the myths in neoliberalism? Well, the first myth fundamentally is that business can do much better at anything than the government. Okay, so remember, it's, if you're a conservative in the United States, it's small government, big business. And because it does it better, it's more efficient and cheaper. And competition is the only legitimate organising principle for human activity in this model, right? So this immediately ties it directly back to patriarchy. Remember that in the patriarchal world, human beings are successful because, some people can outcompete other human beings, and that fosters a sort of, quasi-evolutionary process wherein, the strongest, the fittest are the ones that survive. Now, by that thinking, we should have left all those weak and incapable humans through our revolution behind, right? And we in fact probably should be more like Superman, almost indestructible, because it's taken many, many thousands of years, in fact a couple of millions of years for us to evolve to the point that we are. The archaeological evidence doesn't show that. What the archaeological evidence shows is that human beings are much, much more about caring for one another, and it's not necessarily the same human, right? We know that Neanderthals and modern humans actually interbred, they overlapped. So all those bunnies who are into ethnic purity, forget it, because the chances are you've got at least 1 to 3% of Neanderthal genes in your system, which is a good thing. It's also got a few drawbacks, but by and large a good thing. Okay, core myth 2. That government regulations interfere and are a burden on business. Okay, and so, business practices should be unencumbered. They should be able to do what they want, and the market, as a natural force, will automatically regulate and enforce. The only problem with this idea is that it's a bit like giving Dracula the keys to the blood bank. Eventually, Dracula is very fat and bloated, and everyone else is starving and dead. Okay, so this is really problematic, right? Because if you put, say, fossil fuel companies in charge of managing climate, there's a conflict of interest, right? So the idea, let me get back to the nurses, the idea that we need to have a hospital system or a medical system that runs efficiently doesn't necessarily equate to one that is effective. I.e., you can make lots of stuff efficient, but at what cost, right? And in medicine and in psychology and psychiatry, the whole point is to establish something that is effective over the long term. Okay, the third myth. And this is a really interesting one. This is a moral thing that keeps being bandied about, for which is actually little, if any, evidence. And that is that people, if they're given a choice, prefer to live off welfare. They don't want to work. And so no one will work if there's a welfare system. Again, evidence is contrary to this particular myth. Now, the other one, and this is where it gets really up my nose, is that in this model, in the neoliberal model, you are completely and totally and utterly responsible for yourself and yourself only. And if you're having a hard time in the system, you need to change yourself. So how does that work? Well, let me give you an example. In many corporate settings, and including the public service now, when people put their hand up and go, look, I'm really, really stressed, I'm not coping very well, life is not very enjoyable. I'm at work at 7 o'clock in the morning. I come home at 7 at night. I don't see my family, and then I'm getting called in, okay, and do more shifts, extra shifts, overlapping shifts, night duty, da-da-da-da. What does the organisation, what does the system do? It offers you a well-being course on how to be more resilient. Well, the problem doesn't actually lie with the employee. It actually is a systemic problem. But the system is not taking up its ownership of being part of the problem and doesn't instigate the required changes because it says, well, if you're stressed, that's your problem, not ours. Now, as someone working in this field as a clinician, there's a part of me that's progressively getting sick and tired in dealing with the psychologically injured from the workplace. The workplace continues on. It's exploitative. And then we send them back, hoping that they're, going to perform better. And when they don't, we have the audacity to put them on a performance management program. And I just think that's insult to injury. And it's time that we held those who believe they lead us and are in charge, we hold them to account. And there's lots of places where there is starting to be some groundswell. But to break unions and to silence the dissent, in my book, is simply a way of ensuring the continuation of the slavery that's emerged out of the techno-feudal neoliberal context. It's time that this thing really, really got put out to pasture. Euthanized, in other words. So when you look at the politicians that are putting their hand up for leadership roles, look at the way that they see the world. Reflect on the way that you see the world. We have a community at the moment where people who are working 2, 3, 4 jobs are homeless or they struggle with getting into the property market. And if you're on the gig side of the economy, you will never get there. You will never be able to buy into the wealth creating aspect of our economy, which is property. Because you're precluded. The bank's not going to give you any money. You don't have what it takes to show security in that area. So, some of you may go, well, you're having a good rant, get that off your chest. I was talking about this in the mid-80s when the whole neoliberalist project of the free market economy was really coming out in the fore, and when people talked about if we free up big business to be less incumbent, to be able to pay less taxes, all that wealth is going to trickle down. I'll call bullshit on that. I haven't seen any trickle down. All I see is it being vacuum cleaned up so that we got trillionaires emerging in the economic system, but the middle class is now poverty stricken. So you as a citizen, firstly, do you really believe that you have a process of democracy at work here, or is it a hegemony or an oligarchy or a plutocracy? It ain't looking like democracy to me. And if we're going to really affect change, we need to come together and we need to have people who represent the middle class, the capacity to have an overall wealthier, healthier, spiritual community, not religious. Okay, folks, and on that note, I want you to all look after yourselves and each other, because that's the only way we're going to get through this. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email miranda@nortainment.com. That's MIRANDA at NOIRTAINMENT.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.